This is Theology Bits, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. I'm Pastor Ben. This video is our fifth in the installment of on the book of Psalms. Once again, it's not on Psalm 5, but the fifth video on Psalms. And this video is going to emphasize another category of Psalms. And remember, the reason that this is being done is because we use these categories to help us understand the richness of the theology of the Psalms. There's a lot going on in Psalms, and if you just jump into one with no expectation at all of what's going on, it can be sometimes a little hard to see what's happening because they are poetic and they're deeply emotive, but there's also some really interesting teaching going on and expressed in the book of Psalms, and actually some teaching that's only in the book of Psalms, that it's obviously reflective of a larger theology, but it just didn't happen to be part of the rest of the Hebrew Bible. And so Psalms are incredibly valuable for us. One of those things is what we're looking at today, which are called royal psalms. Now, there's two aspects of royal psalms. Obviously, it has something to do with kingship. Well, there's two components. There's human kingship, of which there's much in the Hebrew Bible to talk about it. And then there is the conversation of God's kingship, which is there is far less outside the Psalter on that theme. It's there, don't get me wrong. It is absolutely there, but it's less profound. The Psalms are a gift to us to show that. But to understand first what's going on, let's begin on this side in human kingship. Now, human kingship, as you know, probably, arises with the king Saul and then David and Solomon. And there's a lot going on in there in the book of Samuel to Kings with kingship, where it seems to be this thing in 1 Samuel 16 that was absolutely do not do this, and yet 1 Samuel 8, do not do this, but then they need to, and then it is inevitably going to fail. And it does at the end of 2 Kings, is when they're all taken off into exile. But it is complicated, and where it ends up for the theology of the royal psalms doesn't reflect all those things. Instead, it reflects there is this covenant. We see it in 2 Samuel with the covenant between God and David, this covenant for the king. And then it's going to be eventually completed with his son Solomon, where it's too complicated for this one video other than just to say three things get put together. That is a temple. This is why Solomon is important, because of course David doesn't build the temple, Solomon does. The mountain, meaning Mount Zion itself, which David of course makes as the capital, and then Solomon puts the temple there, and then the person, the king. And in the theology of Hebrew Bible, especially in 1 Kings, these things become interdependent. And that's what this covenant sets up. It's not really completed until later, which is to say that God has placed a different color here, a servant, a king, in a particular place, and the king manages the temple. How you worship God and how God's rule is enacted are together permanently. That's the whole idea of building this permanent house on a particular mountain. And that pretty soon there is a obvious view that these are going to last forever. These are going to be an enduring covenant between the king and the place governed by the worship site. These three become incredibly closely tied together. And that so when we talk about this, we're talking about two things. We're talking about the king as God's agent, but not vaguely, not just in some sort of, well, whatever this person does is obviously what God wants, because many times the kings do not do what God wants, and the prophets call them out for it. But instead, there is the enaction of Sinai, meaning when Torah was found. So Zion, John Levinson particularly makes this strong point. Zion, the mountain, the covenant with David, the Zion covenant, is the enactment of Torah. And if you read the Deuteronomistic history, before there is a king, you see this dynamic. There is God, there is Israel. Anything that ties them together is Torah. Sometimes the people follow Torah, sometimes they don't, but it's directly. Then you now introduce a king within this. And you'll notice where it interrupts the cycle. Because it is the nation as a whole going to follow Torah or not? Well, now, before it was about, well, look at them, are they following it? Well, now there's a person who is politically going to make them follow Torah or not. And you see this dynamic of when you have a good king, they do. And they're in a better place spiritually. And then when they have a bad king, even if the people want to follow Torah, you have the king who's interrupted the cycle. And so you end up with this idea that Sinai is now processed through, Sinai being Torah, Zion. And so God's agent rather matters. And that it is, this kingship will last forever. And so that, because that's how God's covenant lasts forever. And so the royal psalms are looking at this covenant in a deep way in order to see the way in which God is interacting with Israel through the worship site in a particular place and through ruling. And so you often get this king will last forever and be there on this earth, and it is a righteous thing when it's acted rightly because of this structure. Now let's flip the script, because that's the human kingship built on David's covenant. Now we have the language of God's kingship. Now this shows up in many Psalms, but probably most profoundly in Psalm 93, 97, and 99, which all shout out, Adonai is king. God is king. And then it does some interesting things, because it doesn't do something we might have expected. That is, it doesn't often emphasize Israel, amazingly. It does secondhand. What it talks about is God's kingship over the whole of creation. See, Israel is just a part. Instead, this is more global. It is the whole of creation, and creation, and often described, by the way, as the victory over creation. God has put silence the winds and so on. What God's power over creation, and then often creation's response. So that the trees of the forest clap their hands in the presence of God. And so you have the focus is far less, this is all about Israel, the nation state, Israel. And in fact, if you read the writings, there's less of it, because after the nation falls apart and is off in exile, and then when they come back, they don't get the nation again, there's a less emphasis. Here, it's all about, well, that was never the real king in the first place. God was the ruler, the real ruler. And so it's instead over all of creation, wherever it is, and then creation's response. And Israel is not necessarily explicitly part of it. It is, of course. But it often will talk about then, well, if God is a king, God has decrees. And the emphasis is these things are eternal. So, for example, we can historically say Torah came at a particular point in time with Moses. And that's true. But they would say, but the decrees of God that were behind that Torah were always there and always will be there. What's more, the emphasis is often almost in contrast to human kingship, because the point is about the permanence of God's kingship compared to human kings. As we said over here, the problem is when you have a good king who wants to follow Torah and gets them to do it, then it goes relatively well. But as soon as that king dies, you have a new king who may not have the same position. And it's the fluctuation that's the problem. Not just that the king can die, but that they act so differently. This is about the constancy of God compared to the change of human action. Here, it doesn't really matter if it's a bad or good king, because after all, is it really one or the other? It's all temporary, and they change their minds. They make mistakes. Almost every king we have a story about makes mistakes in addition to doing things well. It's not all one or all the other, at least not usually. Here, the point is exactly that. So some have in fact seen that these two types of psalms don't even interact, because after all, they seem to be in competition with one another. One point is psalms are made to have a variety of theologies within them, but also there's a tension here that I think is important. That yes, there is Zion and temple and mountain, but the point was always God's action. Because who's the real ruler here? This is always framed through a covenant with God, but behind it all was really God's kingship. And that tension is always present, so that when this falls apart, this has not. And when this feels like it's not there, meaning says God's ruling, but it doesn't feel like God's ruling, that there is a permanency, there is a constancy beyond a particular aspect. That's why it's all of creation. It's so much bigger than we could have imagined. A very different emphasis, but made to be in coordination with one another. Again, this is the Psalms are royal Psalms, and the way that this brings out a different kind of theology than we see necessarily in other books. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.